Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. You can find show notes, how to contact me, sign up for our mailing list, and how to support the History of the Papacy by going to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. Two great ways to support the History of the Papacy are leaving your ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. And another really great way to support the History of the Papacy is by going and joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits to you for supporting the show on Patreon. You will receive early and advertisement-free content, bonus episodes, monthly book drawings, and most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the lists of bishops commemorated in order of their precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you'll be on the lists of the History of the Papacy patrons. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William B., Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, Sarah, William H., Augustus, Keanu, and Judy at the Alexandria level, Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, and Steve, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level, and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Leonard the Great, Alex the Great, and Amma the Great. With that, I hope you enjoy this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back, everyone. In this episode and in the last episode, we have been joined by special guest Glenn Amorosia. In today's episode, Glenn is going to continue to lead us through some of the important documents and encyclicals of Pope Pius IX and later popes. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, I asked Glenn if he wanted to plug any of his books or any of that, and he declined, but he did ask if we could mention the Adult Congenital Heart Association. Any donation to them would be greatly appreciated. It would especially be appreciated if you could make a donation in the name of Glenn's son, Dale Amorosia, who passed 4 years ago from a congenital heart defect. Both Glenn and I definitely thank you for listening and for considering to donate to this really great charity. To learn more, you can find links in the show notes, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. Interesting. Did you mention it that how these encyclicals are referred to, like you say, Rerum Novarum? Maybe just because that's commonly how they're referred to as. The name of the encyclical. The encyclicals are initially written in either Italian or Latin, usually Latin, but and the name of the encyclical comes from the first words of the Latin. So Rerum Novarum, those happen to be the first words. Now, and fortunately, sometimes the title has to do with the topic. Sometimes, however, you'll get a name that has nothing to do. It just happens to be the first few words of the encyclical. You'll always see then, after it, the English translation. So Rerum Novarum, if you look it up, it'll say Rerum Novarum, then it'll say On Labor or On Labor and Capital. If you just look at the Latin title, you may have no idea what it means until you start reading it, of course. But as shorthand, that's what the title is, even if that title doesn't have anything necessarily, it's not giving you any clue of what that encyclical is about.
Exactly. In fact, some of them, since I don't read the Latin version of them, but I see the Latin title, I have no idea what it may have meant.
Very generally, how long are these letters or encyclicals?
Well, the more profound ones, if I may use that term, tend to be longer. Some are as long as 40 or 50 pages, like the one most recently written in 2015, Laudato Si, by Pope Francis, is quite long. But there's some that are only a page long or 2 pages long. So they can vary. I would just say on average, they're between 10 and 15 pages. Like the ones that I looked at, the one I've been talking about on Freemasonry and on socialism by Leo XIII, those tend to be around 15 pages long. On Rerum Novarum, I think was in the same category. They tend to be a little longer. One thing I might mention is the reason Pope Leo XIII wrote 90 encyclicals in 25 years, as opposed to John Paul II, who wrote only about 13 or 14 in 25 years, is he was confined to the Vatican. He never left the Vatican. Now, I assume that he really never left the Vatican because he was in such disagreement with the nation of Italy and the government of Italy. So he had a lot of time on his hands, as opposed to John Paul, who could get on a plane and he flew to hundreds of countries and he visited all the dioceses in Rome. Whereas Pope Leo XIII, he wrote at least a dozen encyclicals to specific countries, commenting on their civil situation in that country, to Belgium, to Portugal, to Bolivia, to Peru. I mean, there's probably just no country that he probably didn't write to. A couple to France, a few to Germany, that type of thing.
That's interesting. Because now, since the 1870s and progressively towards the modern era, there's been different ways that popes and everybody can get a message out. And that leads me to the question of, what's the weight of these documents for, say, later generations or today, when somebody's referring back to, say, this document on socialism or on any of the encyclicals? How are they used today?
They're very much still used today. The Catholic Church is still opposed to socialism, and I don't have the quote in front of me, but there's as recently as the somewhere in the 2000s, the future Pope Benedict XVI, at that time Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, he wrote a statement that you can't be a Freemason and a Catholic. And it's also been said you can't be a socialist and a Catholic. So, and they often will refer back to Pope Leo XIII and his documents. And they'll also refer to, like I said, there's been a number of commemorations of Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum over the years, probably at least a half dozen to 10. In fact, some of the commemorations to Rerum Novarum, they have their own Rerum Novarum, like in I think it was 1967, Pope Paul VI wrote Papal Progressio, and there's been a number of commemorations for that, even though it started out as a commemoration to Rerum Novarum. But these are often referred to, and I'll read you something here, and this is from Pope Pius XII. Now, keep in mind that the Catholic Church says the Pope is infallible. Now, that doesn't mean everything he says is infallible, but they say when he speaks ad cathedra, which means from the throne or from the chair, he is infallible. That means without error. So back in the 1950s, when Pope Pius XII was trying to establish the credibility and importance of the encyclicals, he wrote an encyclical. It was called it was in 1950, Some False Opinions Threatening to Undermine the Foundations of Catholic Doctrine. The encyclical was called Humani Generis. But he said, if the Supreme Pontiff, now he's talking about encyclicals, I won't read the whole paragraph, but if the Supreme Pontiffs in their official documents purposely pass judgment on a matter up to that time under dispute, it is obvious that matter, according to the mind and will of the pontiffs, can be any longer considered a question open to discussion among theologians. So he's basically saying if there was an open issue coming into the encyclical and the Pope addressed it in that encyclical, it is now a closed issue to theologians. Now, that's interesting, kind of the wording. Does that mean that another Pope could come along and change it or modify it? So, and we could probably write books and many podcasts about that topic.
Steve here again. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like Josh Cohen's Eyewitness History and many other great shows. Go to Parthenon Podcast to learn more. And now, here is a quick word from our sponsors. So we really could say that as far as ex-cathedra statements go, there's only been a small handful of them, as opposed to scores of encyclicals. And those ex-cathedra statements are pretty straightforward, where these encyclicals are really loaded with information and really pregnant with ideas and that sort of thing that are maybe debatable.
Yeah, the only two infallible statements of recent time, and probably of even longer than that, was Pope Pius IX when he declared the Immaculate Conception. I think that was in 1854, which means that the Virgin Mary was born without sin. And then in 1950, when Pius XII declared Mary's Assumption, which means she was taken bodily after she died straight up to heaven. These were infallible statements. And I think, I was talking to someone, I think there's considered direct infallibility, which would be like those, and then indirect infallibility. That's probably the wrong terminology, but you could probably find something and I've had discussion with people, you could find something in a encyclical that some people might say is infallible. Well, I think that would come more under the terminology of indirect, because I have yet to read anywhere in a encyclical where the Pope said he was speaking infallibly.
Yeah, so there really is a procedure for something to be infallible. I think that that's sometimes something that is maybe people misunderstand or aren't interpreting that an infallible statement is very specific, and that it isn't every word that comes out of the Pope's mouth or everything that's penned is infallible.
It's very rare, Steve. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I know of nothing that Francis, Benedict XVI, John Paul II, any of them said that was considered infallible directly. Now, there might be people out there who would try to read something into it, but you wouldn't find that specifically stated by that particular.
Maybe before we dig into it, or if you have a different idea, but before we dig into some more of the topics of these encyclicals, and we're really going to focus in, we're not going to look at the whole breadth of encyclicals from the 1870s to now, because there is kind of a break. We're going to look at really that the first chunk of them, because they have a continuous theme. What I'm wondering is that there was several popes, and we've had many popes between the 1800s and 2020 when we're recording this. What is there a continuity between the encyclicals?
I would say there certainly is now, especially now that there are not so many being written, but there's certain topics that come up over and over again. And I would say the predominant one that comes up is unity. The Catholic Church sees that it is the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and the Pope is the one leader of that church. There is a number of encyclicals that address in different ways that unity. In the end of the 19th century, and certainly in the 20th century, a number of popes address their desire to see the Orthodox churches of the East united under the papacy with one church. Now, I have friends who are Orthodox who would certainly not agree with that. They might agree with becoming one, but not under the papacy. But that is certainly a theme that you will see over and over again in different forms. And they do it in different ways. Another theme is the continuation of this attack on the rationalism. And I'll just give you two examples. One was in 1905, Pope Pius X wrote a encyclical, and excuse my Latin again, but it's Pascendi Dominici Gregoris, which means, and the English title is on modernism. I think he wrote that in 1907. He took all of these isms and so-called errors that we saw that Pope Pius IX wrote about in 1864, and wrapped them all under the topic of modernism. And the Catholic Church to this day still opposes modernism, which is these rationalistic, naturalistic, materialistic, socialistic, Freemason ideas that are out there that try to knock the church off the pedestal that it was on in Europe. And in 1907, he was basically attacking the growing political power of the socialists and these other organizations. The second example, and I'll just advance forward quickly, Pope Pius XI, during the 1930s, and there's a big change, obviously, from 1907 to the 1930s. We had the growth of the totalitarian regimes of fascism, Bolshevism, Nazism, all these organizations where they have now gone from being political parties and certainly secret societies. They've now taken over whole governments of major countries. And he turned in one of his encyclicals. He wrote a number of encyclicals specifically against Germany, Italy, the Republicans in Spain, the anti-Cristeros in Mexico. He wrote a number of encyclicals, and he enlightened all these totalitarian, socialistic, fascistic states to being pagan. And he came up with a term, instead of idolatry, they believed in stateolatry, basically saying that the state is the idol, is the God that has taken the place of Jesus Christ and the Trinity. And I forget exactly which encyclical, but he used that term, and it's kind of a continuation of a theme. Pope Pius XII in the 40s and 50s also used that term as he attacked. His main attack in the 50s was mainly against communist China, but he wrote a number of encyclicals in the 50s. Right, in fact, in a 2-week period of time, he wrote 3 encyclicals against the Soviet put down of the Hungarian Revolution. So he wrote 3 encyclicals. They weren't that long, but they were all against the Russians and the Soviet regime putting down that. So those are a couple of the themes that you'll see throughout the encyclicals as we go into the modern era.
It's probably important to say, too, that just because they were writing against the socialists, these popes weren't necessarily freewheeling, laissez-faire capitalists, that it wasn't a binary issue, and they weren't framing things in that way.
No, and that's why I would encourage people to read Rerum Novarum, because it's kind of the cornerstone of Catholic social teaching. Leo XIII, when he wrote that, he was Rerum Novarum on capital and labor. He was trying to draw a line between the two. He's very clear to say that just because you are the ruler, just because you're the owner of a company or owner, does not mean you can just walk all over the working man. This is not just laissez-faire. And in fact, he makes a statement, I believe it's in Rerum Novarum, that you don't own the property. Everybody owns the property. Now, you may own the property if you have the deed to it, but the property belongs to the world at large, and it comes from God, and you must administer it in that way. On the other hand, he does defend private property, and he says that the working man has the right through his work, through his intellect, to own property.
Do you think that these encyclicals were meant to not modernize, because like you said, modernism was called a heresy, but do you think it was trying to refresh and bring into the modern era, so to speak, the traditional Catholic teachings, or was it trying to entrench older ideas?
Well, I would say yes. It's trying to do both. As you read these encyclicals, they are very much trying to reestablish after World War I, after World War II, after these socialist movements, Bolshevistic and totalitarian movements, trying to reestablish the foundations of the Catholic Church, whether it be the hypostatic union, which said that Jesus was one person and in 2 natures, Theocotus, which was Mary was the mother of God. They're trying to reestablish dogmas such as that. On the other hand, they're definitely trying to say we don't favor one particular form of government or the other. Now, keep in mind, in the 1700s and even in the early 1800s, they were joined at the hip with some of these absolute governments, such as the Louis in France. And they are now moving themselves away. However, having said that, when you read the encyclicals, they certainly had a more pro-Western bent. They were very much against Bolshevism. Pope Pius XII wrote a couple encyclicals towards the end of his papacy against communist China. So their ammunition is definitely aimed towards these totalitarian governments, and they tend to favor the Americans. So they will definitely put in some pot shots at the Americans. In fact, they even had, I don't know if it was under Pope Leo XIII, they had an ism that was known as Americanism, which was kind of synonymous with materialism and hedonism. If you read the most recent encyclical going into 2015 with Laudato Si by Francis, which is Laudato Si, I'm not even sure what it means, but the English title is On Our Common Home, and it's very much about the environment. But he is very much against what I would think he's thinking in terms of is hedonism, materialism. He terms the word throwaway culture. So you can't help but think that he's taken some pot shots at the West, and in particular at the United States.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors. Were there any popes? You've said that there is a continuation of theme between, and there's probably two different eras after the 1800s. Were there any popes that broke from that theme or had some really different ideas in their encyclicals that didn't jive, for lack of a better word, with what popes before or after them said? Maybe they were rattling some cages.
Well, there were popes that were conservative, and then there's popes that are considered more progressive. I would say, and I don't want to get too far, and maybe we'll close in this with this pope, but good Pope John the 23rd. He came to the papacy in 1958. He was already 76 years old. He was considered certainly a progressive. He was probably considered much more progressive than, say, Pope Pius XII. Pope Pius XII was probably more light on the topics of anti-social. He was more on entrenching the Catholic faith. He wrote a series of encyclicals on the liturgy, on scripture, on the clergy. They were more interested. Now, keep in mind that he was writing after World War II, when the whole world had gone up in the air, and he was trying to re-entrench these. Pope John the 23rd, when he came in, he was supposed to be a transitional pope, keep in mind, at the age of 76. One of the first things he does is he calls Vatican II. And this was kind of a shock to the world that a 76-year-old would do this. But one of the main things that the Ecumenical Council, Vatican II, was designed to do, and there's a constitution that came out of it, was the Catholic Church in the modern world. And I almost see Vatican II being a follow-up or part two to Vatican I. Vatican I really didn't get a chance to really establish its ideas. It only had two constitutions as opposed to the Vatican II, which had 16 different documents, including Gaudium et Spes, or on the Catholic Church in the modern world. And they did some things there that were certainly prohibited in prior to that. I mean, using the vernacular at the Mass as opposed to just Latin, using lay people to distribute communion, to do the readings, that type of thing. These are things that prior to that were not considered to be copacetic.
Well, that's really, I think that we really just scratched the surface, and there's so much more to talk about. I think, is there anything else that you could say to wrap us up today? Because I think we do have to have some more conversations about this to really drill in some more on some of the different topics. This really is a huge topic.
Yeah, let me just close it. There's two reasons that the encyclicals are important. One is that they're from the Pope. He is the head of the Catholic Church. He's the vicar of Christ, supreme pontiff, etc. But the second thing is there are a number of issues that come up in our day and age, such as nuclear war, the arms race, the environment. There's certain topics that if you try to understand what the church's position on, you could go back to Scripture and the early church fathers and probably infer what they meant. But why not go to an encyclical where it's directly addressed? I mean, Pope John the 23rd and John Paul II, they're all very opposed to the arms race and nuclear war. Pope Francis, his encyclical Laudate Si, written in 2015, was a broad discussion of the environment. So, I mean, these are timely topics that are addressed directly, and that is one of the reasons they're very important to read. Now, there aren't as many of them as there used to be, but when they are, people are kind of waiting with bated breath. They usually have some advance notice that there's going to be an encyclical come out, and at least the Catholic community and others are kind of waiting. What is the Pope going to say? Because his take on the world is arguably the most important from anyone in the Catholic Church.
I would definitely love to have you back on the show if you're willing to drill into maybe a specific topic of these encyclicals and maybe throw it out to the audience to ask some questions that they have about encyclicals. I'm sure, like you said, Laudato Si, and there was another important one, I think when Francis was just not too long after he was elected, called Amoris Laetitia, if I'm not mistaken, that I think...
Yeah, that wasn't encyclical, but it certainly stirred a controversy.
And so the people have heard of these, and I think that they would have a lot of questions about some specifics and some of the other encyclicals.
I think that'd be very worthwhile, because I really enjoy your podcast, and when you talk about the history of the papacy, I think it's important to go back and look at what the Pope said in their own words, which predominantly, at least of recent, is most prominently coming out in their encyclical. So, yeah, I think that would be a worthwhile to devote some time to some specific topics.
Well, I'll leave it off today. If you have more questions about these encyclicals, definitely contact me through the website, a2zhistorypage.com, or send me an email, steve@a2zhistorypage.com, or through the Facebook, and we will definitely put together another episode where maybe we talk specifically about a couple of encyclicals or one or two specific popes and their themes in their encyclicals, and then ask some of these questions, because I definitely like to dig in more.
Yeah, and in that vein, if anyone of your listeners hears anything I'm saying that's out of line, or they disagree with, or could have been presented better, I would love to hear their comments on it, because I'm certainly not infallible.
Yeah, that's a great thing too. Well, thank you very much, Glenn, for coming on and putting this together, and I definitely hope to speak to you soon.
Okay, thank you too, Steve, for having me.